Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hey Layne.
Hello, Lisa. Are you ready to continue our little troubleshooting series we've got going on here?
Yes, because I think for every question we get, there's a lot of people that haven't asked the question that are suffering from the problem. So I love this series actually. So
Me
what
too.
is today's all about?
All right, so in the first installment of this little troubleshooting series, we covered cool flower timing troubles. We then moved into some germination troubles with your indoor transplants that you're starting. And now we're going to move on to some seedling troubles in terms of those transplants growing in your grow room. So you got them to sprout, but now there are some issues coming up with the actual seedlings.
That's like perfectly timed. So let's jump in right after. I remind everybody that this podcast is brought to you by thegardenersworkshop.com, which is what keeps Layne and I busy during the day. That's where Layne is the seed manager there, as well as the creator of the course, Cool Flowers, Seed to Harvest, that I'm a part of. And you can find what we're doing over there at thegardenersworkshop.com. And we would love to have you drop in on our website any old time.
Yes. Okay, so our first question is one of the most popular questions we get, and I think it's something that has probably plagued just about everyone that has attempted to learn how to seed start at some point or another. And it's my seeds sprout, but soon after the seedlings seem to wither away and die. Why
Mm.
might this be happening? So frustrating, right, Lisa?
Yes, yes. And first off, I think the hardest step is getting them to sprout. I mean, there's just so
Yeah.
many controls that you have to have, the heat mat, and do you use a cookie cooling rack? So I feel like, it's easier to fix seedling growing problems probably than it is seed sprouting problems. So if you get your seeds to sprout and they pop up and then they just kind of sit there and wither away, I would say the most frequent issue I think that people are experiencing is overwatering, meaning you're not maybe necessarily leaving water in the tray, but your soil is not drying out. Because what I didn't understand is that your roots need as much oxygen as they do water. And when the soil is moist and wet, they really aren't getting a whole lot of oxygen. So it's only during that dried out period that they really get that oxygen. Another really common issue is the air temperature. So once you have vegetative growth starting, and because we hear this especially in not necessarily cool flowers, but in early spring, how we were talking about before, people have
Yes.
trouble. Typically, people are trying to start warm season annuals in a garage that has no heat and it's 45 degrees outside and their garage is 55 degrees. Well, think about, when do plants grow out in our garden? When it's warm, when the sun is shining and it's warm outside. And so you have to have a little bit warmer air temperature, and you have to have that wet to dry life cycle in a 24-hour period.
Yeah. So what's most likely happening to your seedlings, if you notice they're growing fine and then all of a sudden they look like they're almost pinched off at the base or something, which is
Oh,
devastating to find, they're probably suffering from something called damping off. And we actually have done an entire episode on overwatering and damping off. And that was episode 31 if you want to go back and check that out for more details. But cool, wet conditions really are perfect for those damping off pathogens to thrive and ultimately kill your seedlings. Damping off can occur under different conditions than that, but that's probably the most common. So we see this a lot with either very early spring transplants are being started, or like Lisa mentioned, maybe the first round of warm season seedlings that you're starting and the temperatures are just a little too cool. I
right.
do think, Lisa, that with soil blocks, because they tend to dry out quite a bit easier and faster than plug trays,
Yeah.
if you do suffer from damping off and you believe it's from an overwatering condition that maybe you can't even control, you're not in there watering watering too much, but the soil in your trays tends to stay moist for long periods of time, you might want to try switching to soil blocks because they're exposed on multiple sides to air and they really do dry out better. And that's going to help at least reduce the chances of those pathogens having their ideal environment to take over.
And Layne, that's a great point. And I feel like that was my huge struggle when I first started trying to start seeds before I knew about soil blocks. It's like you would water and either the top part of the cell would be wet and the bottom would be dry or vice versa. It was very difficult to regulate it. And the fact that with soil blocks, there is no container basically other than the tray they're just sitting on, that the roots have access to oxygen and water, which just invites that cycle that is so helpful for them to grow so much healthier. And I think if we just remember that, the way I love to think of it is I water always first thing in the morning. The blocks are dry. Come in the morning, they're dry. I water them thoroughly. They're wet, wet, wet. They're getting deep, long drinks. And then by the end of the day, the work day around here at 3 or 4 o'clock, you can see that they're already starting to dry out. And then as evening comes on, they're getting drier and drier. And then overnight, the lights go off at 10 p.m. on a timer. And when that light goes off at 10 p.m., they're pretty much dry. So all night long, those dry blocks are getting a lot of oxygen. And the next morning, I come in and water them and start the whole cycle over again. That's what you're looking for. For me, it was a lot easier to regulate the watering with soil blocks than any other method I ever tried.
Lisa, can you remind everyone what the ideal temperature conditions are for growing cool season hardy annuals indoors?
So my grow room, we tend to keep at 65 to 70 degrees. And once we start having plants growing in there, and once we get a lot of them, I go closer to 70. Because you do need a little bit of warmth. But during the day, our room, because it's southeast facing, does get a little warmer during the day, but at night it doesn't. It does still have that cooler period. So 70 is what you're looking for. 70 in a perfect world, you would have your heat mat in a 65-degree room somewhere, starting your seeds. Then you would move them to your grow light room where it's 70 to 75 once the plant started growing. That it really helps the vegetative growth, the soil blocks dry out quicker. It's just very, so I kind of go in the middle of that because all of mine is in one room.
So if you are experiencing damping off, again, check your temperature conditions in your room, and then also make sure you're not overwatering, either because you actually are watering too frequently or because your soil is just not able to dry out because of those temperature conditions. And something less common, and I think it's a little more obvious for people, is your seedlings could actually die if you have a very warm situation, for example, and you aren't able to water enough. That tends to be more obvious to people that they've just sort of shriveled up due to an underwatering situation.
Right. And as a note, you never want to leave standing water in these trays because we use trays without drainage holes because of the nature of our grow lights being stacked on shelves. You always pour off any excess water before you leave them.
That is such a good point, Lisa. I think that's a place where things can really go sideways.
Yeah.
All right, moving on. My seedlings are discolored, so maybe they're red or they're yellow or some other fun color other than green, and they look unhealthy in general. How can I fix this?
So there are surely some specific flowers that kind of do this. You can almost count on. Statice is one of them. Statice leaves will turn purple, as well as dianthus over a deficiency.
Yes.
First, I want to say they grow out of this once you get them planted outside, but we provide a weekly dose of general purpose organic liquid fertilized with the seaweed fish. And unless they're suffering and not really growing, and again, discoloration can come from overwatering.
Yes.
That's because what happens when you overwater, it makes other things happen. The plant's now stressed and that makes it more susceptible. So overwatering can also create discoloration, but a nutrient deficiency can, or a buildup. But again, our goal is always to start our seeds, to grow our transplants, not fast, but quickly so that we can get them out to the garden. I barely ever sit on a transplant more than 4 or 5 weeks, and that's unusual. Usually it's 3 to 4. because they don't want to grow in a container. They want to be out in the garden, right? And most often, especially with Sweet William that can get some purpley leaves, you plant it out in the garden and before you know it, there's no more purple leaves. So it kind of
Yes.
corrects itself. So you'll have to, that would definitely be a good search engine question with a description of what color you're seeing and what you're seeing it on.
So there are lots of different things that could cause your seedlings to be discolored, but the most common ones we tend to see are some sort of a nutrient deficiency or over or under watering.
Yeah.
And again, a lot of times the discoloration tends to go away once you actually transplant the seedlings out. And it's so true, Lisa, that there are some seedlings that just seem to be more prone to doing this.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to another question. My seedlings are stunted or slow to grow. What might be causing this?
You know, it's like we can give the same answer to almost all these
Yes,
questions, right?
it's true.
Overwatering, lack of nutrition, or is too cool conditions. You know, I mean, if you want the tops to grow, the vegetation, it's got to be 70 degrees or more. And just what I have found when it warms up, you just generally have less problems. And why is that? Because when it warms up, the soil dries out quicker. And you know, so when you water the next morning, they're really dry. So it's kind of the same. Another issue that we often hear about is I've got algae or mold, you know, they're not sure what it is, growing on the surface of that block. Is it going to harm my seedlings? Well, I've in fact found that no, that does not harm your seedlings. What harms the seedlings is what caused the mold and the algae to grow, which is overwatering. You know, I mean, I've done my share of it, is how I know this.
Even just forgetting to empty a tray out after watering and it's sitting for an extended period in a pool of water, that can do it.
That is so true, Layne. So for us, you know, we have so many trays. And if I'm in the grow room, usually I go in there, do all my watering, then I go back to put my eye on every single tray to see, do I need to dump it? Is there standing water, or is it so dry that maybe we didn't put enough water? If I get interrupted, if somebody comes in and says, can you come look at this for a minute? I am so structured. I like forget to come back.
Yes.
And maybe some trays sat with a little bit of water in them just over one night. The next morning I find them, oh my gosh, look, they're still wet. You know, I left water in there. That's enough to get something growing. But I also have found that if you really stick to your guns and warm it up and don't let it happen again, you can kind of curtail that growth. But it's the same cause, overwatering.
So if you are having slow growth or your seedlings seem to be stunted, make sure that your temperatures are in the range we've discussed. Make sure it's not a watering issue, that you're not really overwatering or underwatering. And also, like Lisa mentioned, perhaps consider fertilizing if you're not already, and make sure they're under 16 hours or so of light every day as well.
Yes.
Sometimes this can happen if someone's growing seedlings on a windowsill that actually doesn't get as much light as you would think that it gets.
Yes.
All right, on to our last question. And this is, I have not been able to plant my transplants on time, and I'm worried they're getting too large in their trays. What can I do? So this often happens when people go to plant their cool flowers out and they think, oh, the weather, it's just too warm, or it won't stop raining, and they have to delay their planting, and then their transplants suddenly get way too big in their trays and they're worried about them getting stressed. What can people do?
Sure. So there's several things that I immediately start doing. So usually when you're at this stage, they're outside in the hardening off area, right? They're on their way. You know, next step would have them planted. First thing we do is slow down on watering. We just give them enough water to keep them happy and healthy. We stop fertilizing at that point. And for those plants that are branching plants, they can be pinched to buy you 2 weeks easy in the tray. You know, I know for me, think of one particular year, we used to grow thousands and thousands of snapdragons, and we had tons. I mean, and when you start seeds like that with that kind of volume, it's like a freight train. You know, everything has to run kind of on time or the backup. They start piling up. And we had so many snapdragons that were supposed to be planted. Well, it was just raining like cats and dogs for the next, 10 to 14 days. So I made the decision to pinch everything. And that just bought us 2 weeks of time, because I don't like to plant pinch stuff until it recovers from the pinch, which is about 10 days or so. And so pinching would be the last ditch effort. But of course, you would never pinch like a stock which is a single stem plant. One stem, one bloom is all you get.
And just even the act of moving them out to the hardening off area, that change in environmental conditions and them adjusting to wind and sun and other things out there, that alone will often slow their growth as well. So if you haven't moved them out, you can start with that. And then, like Lisa mentioned, stop the fertilizer, reduce the watering.
Yes.
You still want to water them enough so that they can be healthy seedlings, but don't overdo it. And then you can always, like we mentioned in episode 103, if your reason that you're not planting out is because you think it's a little too warm, remember we talked about creating a sun cap in your rows, which would allow you to plant out. Can you just briefly touch on that, Lisa, even though we went in depth in episode 103?
Sure. And I'll just tell you the experience that we're having here on the farm now since we've done that episode. So insect netting is made to protect a planting. You apply it like a row cover, it goes all the way to the ground, and it protects insects from having access to certain plants like broccoli and cauliflower, the brassicas family. Well, we grow ornamental kale, a cut flower variety, for late fall harvest, right? Well, they have the same problem that broccoli and cauliflower does. The moth lays its egg on plant. That egg hatches, and it's a little caterpillar that eats holes in all of your stuff. So we got the insect netting to help prevent that from happening. So I have my ornamental kale planted. I was really deeply concerned with these hot days being forecasted. Is it going to trap too much heat underneath? And I have been absolutely flabbergasted over how well it's not trapping heat, but it's shading. Our kale plants aren't just surviving over there in this high heat. They are thriving underneath that insect netting because it's shading and cooling it down. And the sun cap that I talk about doing is it's not even all the way to the ground. We fold it in half and just kind of make a little roof to shade the bed, which cools it down. And it's just really allowing me to think that I might be able to plant on time and temper the weather conditions instead of me chasing the weather conditions. It's really, I love it. Really, really love it. And the insect netting is the same width as a row cover. And we have different lengths available. And it is super. I will tell you that I am so hard on row cover. I'm not as careful as I used to be. Oftentimes, if I use stakes in the garden to mark what a planting is, like those are 18-inch by 1-inch little wooden stakes, and you push them in the ground, it is real easy to pop one of those through a row cover because it's so thin. Yesterday, I thought, oh gosh, I've done it now. I put a hole through the insect netting, and I will tell you that stick did not pop through the insect netting. I'm so impressed with how durable it is in the garden. And it's cooling down our stuff. It's awesome.
Yeah. It's such a good trick to have in your toolkit.
Yes.
And then, like Lisa said, you can pinch branching plants. Obviously, you don't want to pinch anything that's a single stem plant. And like we've mentioned in the past, if you really are concerned about it, don't forget that you can always start some insurance seedlings that you may not end up needing, but at least you have them, and that gives you some peace of mind if things really go sideways, because sometimes seedlings, when they're in the tray for too long, they can get pretty ugly pretty fast.
Yeah. And I mean, there's no cure for that except planting them. If they're too far gone, that's not worth planting them. But when they start getting yellowy and stretchy and all that, there's no cure for that. And I've also found planting those types of plants do not perform and produce, and they are not as disease and pest resistant as healthy, younger, stocky transplants. That's why the whole insurance plant thing is such a great idea.
Yes. All right. Well, that does it for this episode on some seedling troubles you might be having, which we hope you're not having. But if you are, hopefully this will help you resolve any of those. And thanks so much for being here again with us. Remember that you can comment over on YouTube or use the form linked in the show notes to submit any additional questions you might have that you perhaps want to hear us discuss on a future episode. And be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're watching or listening so you won't miss any of our future episodes. And also, we appreciate so much when you share with a friend. And just thank you to everybody for being here again.
And friends, if you're listening to this on a podcast, remember you can pop over to our YouTube channel. Layne always puts together a beautiful little slideshow. It had some very precious little seedlings on our one today.
Yes.
I just love seeing those. And friends, we just thank you so much for supporting the podcast and telling a friend. And so until we meet again, ciao.
Bye.